Welcome everybody to the Travers webinar on Brexit and your supply chain. My name's Ben Chivers and I'm a partner in the Commercial IP and Technology department here. Today I'm going to be talking to my colleague Jonathan Rush, who's been looking in some detail at the likely impact of Brexit on supply chains, particularly the implications of introducing customs controls. Now, while we're not going to be making any firm predictions about what might happen over the next 12 months or so, we are going to try and cover the range of possible outcomes that you need to consider for contingency planning purposes, which seemingly currently still includes anything from a cliff edge to a transition period where everything more or less stays the same. Hopefully you've been able to access the accompanying slides by clicking on the link we provided together with your login details. Don't worry too much about taking notes, as we'll send you all a copy of the slides and a recording of the session. Linked to the slides will also be available afterwards. We've got you all muted because there are a fair number of people on the call and it can cause problems with too much background noise, so you can hear us but we can't hear you. If you do want to ask a question, you can email us at commercial@traversmith.com and we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the talk. Unless you tell us you're happy for us to say which business you're from, we'll keep those anonymous, but if you could allow us to say what sector or industry you operate in, then that would be very helpful. Jonathan, can you talk us through what we're going to cover today?
Sure. We're going to focus on two main scenarios that are at different ends of the spectrum. The first is to assume that everything goes roughly according to what the government says it wants, so we get a transition of around 2 years, followed by a free trade agreement. The second is to look at what might happen in the event of no deal. Both of these will involve customs controls. The difference is that in scenario one, we'd have a bit longer to prepare for them.
Okay, let's start with scenario one then, the transition. The aim of both sides seems to be to ensure that as far as possible everything stays the same. Does that mean that in March 2019 there should be no immediate changes that businesses need to factor into their thinking?
It should do, but there's some uncertainty over the status of agreements with countries outside the EU. So if we want to continue to benefit from all the EU's agreements with those countries during the transition period, then the consent of those countries is going to be required, and that's as been spelled out by the EU in its negotiating guidelines, which are on the slide. The two most concerning areas from a supply chain perspective are free trade and aviation, where there are over 100 agreements in total. Trade agreements are a concern because UK businesses could lose preferential treatment, so higher tariffs would be payable. And when I talk about aviation, I'm referring to agreements which give airlines traffic rights to fly from the UK to non-EU countries. And the concern will be about possible disruption to air freight. That will be a worry because by some estimates around a fifth of UK trade by value involves air freight.
Surely it will be in the interest of most third countries for existing arrangements to continue during the transition?
Well, that's a fair point, and one which the UK government has made. It also says that in its discussions with other countries, most have indicated that they would be prepared to roll over their agreements into the transition period. I've no reason to doubt that, but there's still a risk that not all of them will be rolled over by the end of March 2019, and there are three main reasons for that. The first is that there's a lot to do in the time. It's true that most of these agreements can probably be rolled over based on a fairly short memorandum of understanding or an exchange of letters, but that process needs to be gone through for over 100 agreements, which is a lot of work for the diplomats involved. Ideally, one would want the EU to be backing us up in that exercise, but it's not clear to what extent that's actually happening. Secondly, we know from experience that trade agreements can be derailed by domestic political concerns, often focusing on a single product or an issue that has particular resonance with the public, like chlorinated chickens, for example. To give you an example from the aviation sector, Norwegian Air, the budget Scandinavian airline, had its application to the US for traffic rights held up for several years, essentially because of a very well-organised lobbying campaign from unions for pilots and cabin crew. Their concern was that Norwegian would be competing unfairly by using pilots and crew from countries in Asia, which they claimed had much lower labour standards than the US. The legal case for blocking Norwegian was very weak, but that didn't stop the unions managing to get quite a few members of Congress on side, and even Hillary Hillary Clinton when she was running for president. Thirdly, some countries may decide to play hardball with the UK, the rollover, possibly because they're looking to secure concessions in relation to a possible post-Brexit trade deal. For example, there have been reports that South Korea and Chile are taking that approach on trade, although I'm not aware as yet of any reports of countries being difficult about any of the aviation agreements. Now, picking up on your point, Ben, about it being in the interests of both sides to roll over the agreement, a point that's worth noting about South Korea is that it has a trade deficit with the UK and the EU, so you could argue that it would be in its broader economic interest not to roll over the EU-South Korea free trade agreement into the transition period, because making it more difficult for UK businesses to sell to South Korea would help to bring its trade with the UK back into balance.
But from what you're saying, we're looking at the possibility of a handful of agreements not being rolled over, so we're not talking about a massive risk here.
I think that's right. The most likely adverse scenario is that problems are confined to a minority of countries, which will probably only affect a minority of businesses. But the impact on that minority of businesses could be quite serious, depending how far they're exposed in terms of trade with that territory.
Okay, so how can businesses work out how far they're likely to be exposed to this risk?
Well, let's start with EU trade agreements, which are listed on this next slide. The key question to ask yourself is whether any part of your supply chain involves any of these countries. Now, at first sight, that looks a very long and intimidating list, but a lot of these are very small countries, so it's probably the larger territories you need to focus on. And these are listed on this next slide. Even here, you can see that most of the countries listed are not large in trade terms, so many businesses may be able to conclude that they don't have a problem at all.
But let's say your business is part of a supply chain that does involve some of these countries. What are the risks you need to be aware of?
I'd say the risks are higher for UK businesses that are exporting to these countries rather than importing from them. Let's say you export engineering components to a manufacturer in South Korea, and for whatever reason, it's not been possible to roll over the EU-South Korea free trade agreement into the transition period. At the moment, your customer in South Korea probably pays no tariffs on your goods because that same EU-South Korea free trade agreement has eliminated over 98% of duties. But if there's no rollover, your customer could be looking at having to pay duty based on South Korea's WTO tariff schedule, which could be as much as 8% depending on the precise type of engineering product we're looking at here. If, on the other hand, you're sourcing goods from one of these countries, then on the assumption that we do actually get a transition, the picture's rather better. And that's because both the EU and the UK are proposing that they will continue to apply the terms of their agreements with third countries during the transition.
So we would continue to apply the EU-South Korea agreement to imports from South Korea, even though South Korea wouldn't apply it to exports from the UK?
That's right. It would be a strangely asymmetrical arrangement, which could be problematic in terms of persuading countries to roll over their agreements, because basically it means their exporters or their airlines won't suffer as much if the agreement isn't rolled over, whereas ours will. That may encourage some countries to play hardball in the rollover negotiations, which, somewhat perversely, may increase the risk of failure.
And is the position with aviation agreements broadly the same?
Well, broadly, yes. And the countries with which the EU has aviation agreements are listed on this slide. But unlike free trade agreements, there are no WTO rules to fall back on here. In some cases, there may be older bilateral treaties that were effectively superseded by EU-wide deals, but these are not likely to provide much in the way of a safety net. So if, after Brexit, airlines operating out of the UK don't have traffic rights to fly to and from a non-EU country, then in principle those flights are going to be cancelled. But if, as part of the transition, the UK agrees to abide by the terms of any EU aviation agreements, then you'll have the same kind of lopsided situation as with trade agreements. Carriers operating out of those third countries will be able to fly to the UK and back out again, but carriers operating from the UK will not. So air freight shouldn't grind to a complete halt, but there could be a reduction in capacity on some routes, which could mean higher prices or insufficient capacity to meet demand. As with trade agreements, it's a question of looking at the list of countries and working out if your supply chain depends on air freight to or from that country.
Okay, let's move on to what happens when the transition expires. What are the main changes that supply chains will face?
Well, there are three main changes. The first relates to tariffs. Now, it's a reasonable assumption that if all goes well, we'll manage to secure a free trade deal with the EU that eliminates tariffs on the vast majority of goods, because the EU has had no problem reaching that sort of agreement with countries like Canada or South Korea. But that doesn't mean tariffs will be eliminated on all products. For example, there may well be tariffs and quotas on some agricultural products because the EU adopts a fairly protectionist approach to those markets. The second change relates to VAT. Imports from the EU will be subject to import VAT rather than an acquisition VAT. That's likely to mean that the importer will have to pay import VAT up front at the point of import rather than being able to account for acquisition VAT at a later date in its periodic VAT return. It may be possible to get approval from HMRC for deferment of import VAT, which would allow you to pay later, but the general position is that there will be cash flow implications from that change, which could be quite significant for some businesses. And the third change is the introduction of customs checks, and this is the one with the biggest impact, especially for ports where the bulk of trade is with the EU, like the Channel ports. So, for example, a lorry transporting UK goods to the EU or vice versa will need to provide certain documentation about the load it's carrying. It'll then have to be cleared by customs, which may involve a physical inspection as well as a documentary check.
How much documentation are we talking about here?
At present, businesses importing goods into the UK from outside the EU must complete a form known as a single administrative document and an entry summary declaration. These tell HMRC what type of goods you're bringing in, how much they're worth, and so on. Additional specialist documentation is required for more highly regulated goods. So, for example, in some cases, documentation may be required to prove that relevant standards have been met. Assuming we're in a free trade agreement with the EU, then if you want to avoid having to pay tariffs, you'll have to provide proof of origin documentation to show that the goods originated in the UK. This is to guard against, for example, Chinese goods entering the UK at a tariff lower than the EU's own external tariff on those goods, and then being transported to the EU tariff-free, having been passed off as coming from the UK. It's also possible that HGV drivers may have to produce permits entitling them to travel to their ultimate destination in the EU.
Okay, what happens next?
Well, customs will review the information it's been sent and either clear the HGV for onward travel or carry out a physical inspection. At the moment, about 1% of trucks arriving at Dover need to be cleared by customs, for example because they've come across the EU from Ukraine or some other non-EU country. Those are cleared in about 10 minutes, but that's obviously going to be completely unworkable once we're in a world where 100% of the trucks arriving at Dover need to be cleared by customs. The Port of Dover's estimate is that a mere 2-minute delay per vehicle will lead to 17-mile tailbacks on both sides of the channel about once a week. So what would probably need to happen is that customs clearance would have to take place at new infrastructure inland. The problem with that is that it'll be pretty challenging to have that infrastructure ready in time for 2021. If you look at recent port expansion products in, say, Dunkirk or Calais, these have typically taken place over a 4 to 5 year time frame. And ideally, all this would be accompanied by new technology to streamline the administrative side of customs for road haulage between the UK and the EU. So, for example, in its position paper on customs from last August, the UK government proposed a variety of measures designed to reduce border red tape. These included technological solutions like number plate recognition, so as to allow trucks to roll off ferries without having to stop, provided they've declared their cargo to customs electronically and in advance. Now, these are all perfectly sensible ideas, it's just difficult to see them being implemented by 2021, and it's not something you want to be doing against a hard deadline either. For example, a new customs system in the US called ACE, or Automated Commercial Environment, was supposed to have been fully deployed by early 2016, but it too has suffered repeated delays.
But I thought the head of HMRC had said that they're on track to have their new computer system ready by the beginning of 2019. in time for a hard Brexit if it comes to that?
As I understand it, he was referring to a system called CDS, which was due to be introduced anyway because of changes to the EU customs framework, but it's now been substantially upgraded in terms of capacity so that it should be able to handle the 250 million odd customs declarations that are expected when we leave the EU customs union. That replaces a much older system called Chief. Now, it's good news, I think, that HMRC say that they will be ready by 2019, but as far as I'm aware, CDS on its own won't have massive impact on the speed with which lorries can get through the Channel ports, for example, because that requires infrastructure and other types of new technology.
Sure, but going back to basics on all of this, couldn't we just decide to adopt a light touch approach to customs checks? After all, if we've got a free trade deal with the EU, then we're not going to be getting much revenue in the form of tariffs and duties. So that just leaves the risk of goods coming into the country which are unsafe or don't meet the right standards. We've been happy to trust other EU countries to protect us from that for years. So why should the risk suddenly change on the day the transition expires?
Well, in principle, there's nothing to stop the UK adopting that approach, and you can certainly take a completely risk-based approach to customs, as you outlined, but to some extent, I'm not sure it really matters what we choose to do. What matters is how the EU responds to it. Because if EU countries are not willing to introduce similarly relaxed controls and put the necessary resources and infrastructure in place to support them, then you'll get hold-ups on the other side of the channel. That in turn will cause delays here because the whole system is interlinked and depends on efficient throughput at both ends. And we've already seen that happen on numerous occasions. For example, in 2016, when the French introduced increased security checks in the wake of the terrorist attack in Nice, there were significant tailbacks here in the UK as a direct result, and there were similar delays following industrial action at Calais in 2015.
But isn't it in the EU's own interest to have an efficient customs system for handling this traffic? After all, delays will damage their exporters just as much as ours.
You're right that the EU has a significant self-interest in this, and it's worth pointing out that EU countries aren't just sitting on their hands. They have started to recruit significant numbers of new customs officials. But the EU will also be looking at the bigger picture of its trade with the rest of the world, not just its trade with the UK. They'll be worried that if they offer the UK special treatment in terms of customs procedures, other countries around the world will demand it too, and may use WTO rules to argue that they're entitled to it. There's also a genuine concern about what happens if the UK diverges from the EU in future on both tariffs and standards. For example, it's quite likely we would want to lower tariffs on agricultural produce from non-EU countries. So the EU's concern will be that some of that produce will then find its way from the UK into the EU. That kind of activity has already occurred via Norway, which is outside the common agricultural policy, so it sets its own tariffs on food imports. Swedish police uncovered a smuggling operation involving, of all things, garlic imported from China. So in case you were wondering, there is a reason for the second picture on the slide. The smugglers were looking to avoid paying the 9.6% EU tariff on garlic, importing it into Norway at a much lower rate of duty, and then driving it across the border into Sweden, hoping to avoid being checked. They're estimated to have avoided around 13 million euros in customs duties.
One question about these issues. The Prime Minister often refers people to the UK's government's paper on customs arrangements, which was published last year. What does that say, and could it bridge the gap between the UK and the EU on all of this?
The UK paper essentially proposes two options. The first involves a variety of measures designed to reduce border red tape, including technological solutions such as number plate recognitions that we've discussed already, but it's hard to see them being fully implemented by 2021. The other, much more ambitious option would involve the UK checking, on the EU's behalf, where the goods imported from, say, China are destined for consumption in the UK or the EU. If they're destined for the EU, then the UK will apply EU rules to them, the idea being that if they are then incorporated into another product, like a car, that UK-produced car can go to the EU without any customs checks at all. EU car manufacturers shouldn't have anything to complain about because the UK will have applied the EU's tariffs and the EU's product standards on the Chinese components, so there would still be a level playing field. But the main issue with that is that the EU is likely to be suspicious that goods which were supposed to be consumed in the UK and therefore benefited from lower tariffs and possibly lower standards will end up in the EU, much like the garlic we were talking about a few minutes ago. And the paper admits that there will need to be some kind of tracking mechanism to satisfy the EU that the UK is doing its job properly. So again, this looks something that would probably require more than 2 years to implement.
Okay, let's move away from the transition and onto the second scenario of no deal. Before we do so, actually, I would just say if anyone does have any questions, please do feel free to email them to commercial@traverssmith.com, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the talk. So no deal. Presumably the main concern here is the same as at the end of the transition, but the level of disruption is likely to be quite a bit worse because there's even less time to prepare and we wouldn't be in a free trade agreement, so tariffs would be imposed across a wider range of goods.
That's right. As you say, the shift to third country status will be much more abrupt, so the impact will be more severe. For example, there wouldn't be time to put in place much in the way of measures to make customs processes easier to navigate. HMRC estimates that in a worst-case scenario, a lorry going from the Midlands to Germany via the Channel ports or tunnel could take up to 80 hours rather than 12 to 15 as at present. And that's assuming the lorry could get the necessary permits and the EU continued to recognise UK driving licences, although the government has recently introduced a bill which is intended to address these issues in the event of a no-deal outcome. DEFRA also commissioned a report in 2015 about the impact of a tidal surge from the North Sea on the East Coast ports. Now, you might be wondering what that has to do with Brexit, but if we're talking about disruption to places like Dover, then it is relevant by analogy. Now, that report concluded that Dover was particularly critical as it handles 25% of food imports from the EU, and that shortages of fresh food in particular will be likely to arise quite quickly. Now, obviously, in a no-deal scenario, Dover wouldn't be completely out of action as it might be in a flood scenario, but for reasons we've discussed, it would be subject to potentially quite severe congestion and delays. The report concluded that for just-in-time supply chains, the only viable alternative was the Channel Tunnel, but obviously in our no-deal scenario, that route would suffer from the same customs problems as Dover, so it wouldn't help much. The report also suggested that shortages in retail outlets could well be exacerbated by panic buying on the part of consumers, prompted by media coverage.
But we've had dire warnings of this kind of economic impact after the referendum, and they didn't really materialise. In part, admittedly, because there was a policy response in the form of action taken by the Bank of England to calm the markets and so on. But surely there would be a policy response of some kind from the government in this case as well.
I think the difference between the referendum result and 30th of March 2019 is that in 2016, immediately after the vote, nothing had actually changed on the ground. It was much more about perception and market reaction. But if we leave the EU without a deal, there will be significant legal and practical consequences, and it will have an impact on the real economy. You're right, though, that government isn't likely to stand idly by and just watch all this happen. There is likely to be a policy response, and that may take the form of government exercising very broad emergency powers, which it has under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. This legislation was introduced partly in reaction to the tanker driver protests in 2000, which also had consequences for just-in-time supply chains. It could allow the government to do things like limit the HGV traffic passing through Channel ports to essential supplies such as fresh food and medicines, so everything else would have to be rerouted elsewhere, the most obvious alternative being short-sea shipping of unaccompanied containers. The other thing the government could do would be to reduce or remove tariffs on trade with third countries, especially food. Those products typically arrive at ports like Felixstowe or Liverpool, which are already well set up with infrastructure to deal with customs controls. This would incentivise non-EU suppliers to plug the gap in the market left by the disruption at Channel ports. Having said all that, it's important to point out that the DEFRA report also highlighted the resilience and responsiveness of the UK logistics sector, so the market would almost certainly respond as well, and that's something that businesses can generally take at least some comfort from.
Okay, so what you're suggesting is not that we'll be careering around a post-Brexit wasteland like Mad Max, as David Davis might put it, although we might be stuck in a 17-mile tailback on the M20. But the stakes of no deal are still very high for all concerned, not just the UK, but the EU as well. Wouldn't that act as a powerful deterrent against a no deal outcome?
It certainly would, but both sides have also adopted the mantra, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So even if we get an in-principle agreement on the transition in the next month or so, which is what everyone is hoping for, you can't take anything for granted until agreement has been reached on all the other issues which need to be covered off in the withdrawal agreement, and it's all been signed off by the UK Parliament and the European Parliament as well. A lobbyist for the logistics sector that I've spoken to said that in her dealings with officials on both sides who were close to the negotiations, they had all said they very much hoped to avoid no deal, but they couldn't rule it out either, and they were keen that businesses should prepare for it rather than just adopt a wait-and-see approach. And I think the fact that EU countries are recruiting additional customs officials suggests that they're making some preparations for a no-deal scenario too. Having said all that, in a no-deal scenario there would undoubtedly be intense pressure on both sides to resolve the situation, and the chances are that within a matter of months some kind of limited transition would be agreed, allowing hopefully a prolongation of existing trading arrangements until both sides were better prepared. So perhaps what businesses really need to consider is how they would cope with a period of severe disruption starting in the second quarter of 2019 and continuing for a period of months, but hopefully not significantly longer than that.
All right, so let's move on to what you can actually do now to prepare for these eventualities. A lot of businesses would say, how can I possibly prepare when there's so much uncertainty over what I'm aiming for?
I do sympathise with that complaint, but I think there are some clear deadlines to aim for in terms of your planning. The first one is exit day, and the two scenarios you need to be prepared for there are disruption to supply chains due to either no deal or, less seriously, a failure to roll over some third country agreements into the transition period. And then the next deadline to aim at is at the end of the transition. Now that's obviously a bit more of a moving target because we don't know exactly when it will be, but we can say that if it's done on the 2-year timescale both sides are talking about at the moment, then there's likely to be some disruption, mainly around the Channel ports and the Channel Tunnel, so at least some of the planning you need to do in relation to the no-deal scenario is likely to be of benefit at the end of the transition, even if you end up not having to put it into practice at the end of March 2019.
So what's the first thing businesses need to do?
The first thing they need to do is map their supply chain. There are 2 points I highlight here. The first is that it's not sufficient to know who your immediate supplier is. You need to know the identity of your supplier's suppliers all the way along the supply chain. The DEFRA report had an interesting example of UK food manufacturers, many of whom assumed they would not be affected by flooding of East Coast ports because they only dealt with UK wholesalers for their ingredients, packaging and so on. What they hadn't realised was that their UK wholesalers got most of their packaging from the EU, so in fact the manufacturers were more exposed than they thought. And the second point is that you shouldn't concentrate solely on goods which actually originate from the EU. Many goods from the rest of the world come into continental ports such as Rotterdam, but are then distributed by HGV to the UK, and these will be vulnerable to disruption too. Once you've got a clear picture of where your goods are coming from or going to, you should be able to identify where your supply chain is vulnerable to Brexit-related disruption, based on what we've talked about earlier.
And what steps could you take to mitigate the impact of disruption?
Well, it's worth considering whether you should increase your stock levels of certain goods in the run-up to the key dates I mentioned earlier. That will give you some protection against short-term disruption and buy you more time to make alternative arrangements if the problem looks likely to persist. Bear in mind that if consumers start to panic buy, they'll tend to go for longer-lasting, non-perishable goods, so don't assume that shortages will be confined to perishables. Another strategy is to look at other ways of getting goods into the UK or into the EU. For example, can the goods be transported from the EU to the UK as unaccompanied containers using short sea shipping, and then they'll be loaded onto an HGV at the other end? The advantage here is that the goods would be able to enter the UK or the EU at ports which are already well equipped to handle customs checks, because they typically, or they more typically, handle trade with the rest of the world. The same's likely to be true if you're able to switch to a non-EU supplier. Again, their goods are likely to be coming into a port which is already set up to handle customs checks efficiently, so will be less vulnerable to disruption. That said, the overall journey time is likely to be significantly longer than the current journey times of HGVs via the Channel ports or the Channel tunnel, so this is unlikely to be an option for quite a few perishable goods or just-in-time supply chains. And bear in mind that just switching to a new logistics arrangement can cause problems of its own, as shown by KFC's recent difficulties in switching to a new logistics provider for the supply of meat to its UK outlets. Of course, the ideal solution here might seem to be finding an alternative UK-based supplier, because then you shouldn't have to worry about customs delays at all. In that respect, Brexit could represent a major opportunity for some UK suppliers to take business away from their EU competitors. The trouble with that is that if your UK supplier depends on inputs from the EU, then it won't necessarily be as good a solution as it at first appears.
And is there anything you can do contractually to protect your position?
There are certainly some options that are worth exploring. For example, let's say you currently source fresh food from a supplier based in the EU, but there are alternative suppliers in the UK, and they sell mainly to customers in the EU. In the event of a no-deal scenario, the UK supplier is likely to face serious delays getting its products into the EU, because they'll have to go through what's called a border inspection post, and Calais doesn't have one. The nearest one is Dunkirk, and that isn't likely to have the capacity to cope with all the demand from the UK. Now, in that scenario, you may be able to say to the UK supplier, look, we can help each other out here. If you can't sell to your customers in the EU, and I can't get my goods from my suppliers in the EU, I'll buy your goods instead. It needn't always be a firm commitment, it could be a right of first refusal or something like that. Similarly, if you've got a reasonable bargaining power with your suppliers, you may be able to negotiate priority supplier obligations, where they'll give you the first option in the event of product shortages. The earlier you can talk to suppliers about that, the better, as other buyers may have the same idea. It's also worth looking at your supply contracts to see who is responsible for paying tariffs and extra administrative costs associated with customs clearance. The ideal position from a buyer's perspective is delivery duty paid, or DDP as it's commonly abbreviated. But the default position is that unless the contract says otherwise, the seller can normally recover any additional duties from the buyer. Finally, it's worth looking at contracts to see what they say about termination, force majeure, and so on. Depending how your force majeure clause is drafted, it may be sufficient to relieve either you or your supplier of liability in some of the scenarios we've been talking about, particularly where there's been government intervention of some kind.
Is there anything else businesses can do now to prepare?
They should consider whether it would be sensible to adjust cash flow projections to take account of possible VAT changes, purchase of extra stock and other additional costs that might be incurred as a result of some of the scenarios we've been talking about. A second point is that some firms may wish to consider seeking what's called authorised economic operator status. Now, in simple terms, that means you're regarded as a trusted trader, so customs are happy to allow your goods through without the same level of checks that they might otherwise apply. This should help to reduce the potential for delays, to some degree at least, and in some cases it may be sufficient that your wholesaler or logistics provider has or is applying for AEO status. You won't necessarily need it yourself. A point to bear in mind here, though, is that the AEO application process takes around 4 to 5 months, and most businesses probably need a similar kind of period to prepare before they're in a position to actually start that process. So it is something you will need to take a decision on very soon if you're going to do it, especially if lots of other businesses apply at the same time. Businesses should also ensure that they or their suppliers are prepared for the documentary requirements of customs formalities. For example, customs officials have told us they're not confident that businesses will always select the right customs codes for the products they're importing or exporting, and if the forms aren't filled in correctly, then that creates the potential for delays as well. So there's likely to be a need for some training on technical issues like that to make sure that the whole system works efficiently.
So finally, Jonathan, we've been focusing very much in this talk on some of the potential downsides of Brexit. Do you see much in the way of upside for businesses?
Well, yes, I'm conscious that we have been focusing on the downside. So I think that there are some upsides, and the first thing to say is that it's important to keep what we're saying in perspective. Brexit may well prove to be disruptive for supply chains, but it's also likely to open up new opportunities for some businesses. So, for example, ports that don't specialise in roll-on, roll-off traffic could see an increase in traffic, and that in turn may provide opportunities for UK-based logistics firms to take cargo to and from those ports. And there should also be opportunities from opening up to more trade with the rest of the world, especially in areas like agricultural products where the EU is often quite protectionist. And then looking at the wider picture, the biggest opportunity is probably from the possibility of doing our own trade deals, particularly in relation to services where, again, the EU can often be quite protectionist. So, for example, a high-quality deal with the US could provide significant new opportunities for UK businesses. But deals like that are likely to take some years to negotiate, and then several more years before the actual benefits would be felt. So it is important to temper optimism about trade deals with realism about what's actually deliverable in practice.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's been fascinating. Now, there are a couple of questions. I think we've got time. So the first one, the Labour Party has announced that its policy would be to stay in a customs union with the EU. Would that resolve most of the border issues we've been talking about?
If the proposed EU-UK customs union essentially replicated the effect of the EU customs union, then conceivably, yes, it would. But from what Jeremy Corbyn said in his speech yesterday, it didn't sound as if it would go that far. His focus was very much on tariffs. But for the EU to agree not to reintroduce border controls, you'd need full alignment with the EU on regulatory barriers like product standards. In effect, you'd need an arrangement that replicated full single market participation for goods. But he seemed to be ruling that out, or at least that was my take on the speech. And the lack of such arrangement is one of the reasons why there are still border controls between the EU and Turkey. Even though both territories are in a customs union, the EU only waives the need for that type of border control in sectors where it's satisfied that Turkey has brought its own regulations into full alignment with the EU. So that, for me, was the bit missing from Corbyn's sort of policy pitch yesterday, as it were.
Yeah. And I see that amendments have also been tabled to the trade bill and the taxation bill, the taxation cross-border trade bill, which is seeking to force the government to stay in some form of customs union. What would be the impact if those amendments are passed?
Well, I don't want to comment too much on the political impact, but one of those amendments commits the government to a negotiating objective of remaining in the EU customs union, and then another one put forward by Labour's front bench is phrased in pretty similar terms, but it talks about a customs union rather than the customs union. It seems to me that if either were to be passed, then it's quite hard to see how it wouldn't require a change in the government's negotiating position, because so far the government has been very insistent that it doesn't want a customs union, owing to the constraints it would impose on the UK having an independent trade policy. So it would make quite a significant difference to the government's approach to Brexit.
Understood. So I think time is not in our favour. I think we're just about out of time. But and thank you, Jonathan, again. That was fascinating insight into some of the issues that businesses are going to be facing over the next 12 months or so. Before we go, I just want to draw your attention to a client seminar that we're holding in our offices on the 22nd of March. Which is kind of linked to this subject, although not the same. It's dealing with the loss of a key supplier, a topic which has been highlighted obviously recently by the high-profile failure of Carillion, and I fear we may be seeing more similar situations in the not-too-distant future. Do get in touch with us at commercial@traversmith.com if that is something that would be of interest to you. Thank you all for listening.